Bueno, vamos a pasar a la segunda mesa y vamos a cambiar un poquito la dinámica. Lo que vamos a hacer ahora es que vamos a oír primero, de nuevo, insisto, no los voy a presentar, tienen ahí sus biografías en los programas. Va a hablar primero Stewart Martin, después va a hablar David Beech, y lo que vamos a hacer es que ya que acaben de hablar, van a estar los 4 ponentes extranjeros de esta sección y como moderadoras Brenda, Caro y yo, para que haya una pequeña conversación entre ellos, quizá, y también abrir las preguntas al público, y después vamos a tener la siguiente mesa. Entonces, sin más, cedo la palabra a Stewart Martin.
Right. I'd like just to thank Pilar for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here, as with the... Hello? Okay. So yeah, I'm delighted to be here. Many thanks to Pilar and all the other organizers of SITAC. What I'm going to do today is approach this issue about art and value by trying to answer the question, how could one use Marx's theory of value in order to think about value and its relationship to art? And this poses 2 basic problems: a fundamental obscurity around this theory and its general or fundamental constitution, and an obscurity or fundamental neglect of how this could be related to art. So what I want to do is try to illuminate those 2 obscurities. What I'm going to say is going to be very abstract, and it's also going to be orientated towards the bourgeois society, if you like, Marx's primary object. And this is going to make it, in a way, inadequate to the discussion of these kind of mixed social forms that constitute, well, Mexico and the UK certainly. But hopefully we can deal with that. Hopefully what I'll do is nonetheless will be useful, if you like, for that discussion. And I think it's crucial to approach this question of Marx's conception of value through a letter that he wrote to a friend after being very pissed off with the review of his book, in which they said, what is this value stuff? It doesn't really exist. Marx writes, "The chatter about the need to prove the concept of value arises only from a complete ignorance both of the subject under discussion and of the method of science. Every child knows that any nation that stopped working not for a year, but let us say just for a few weeks, would perish. Every child knows too that the amounts of products corresponding to the differing amounts of needs demand differing and quantitatively determined amounts of society's aggregate or total labor. It is self-evident that this necessity of the distribution of social labor in specific proportions is certainly not abolished by the specific form of social production. It can only change its form of manifestation. Natural laws cannot be abolished at all. The only thing that can change under historically differing conditions is the form in which these laws assert themselves. And the form in which this proportional distribution of labor asserts itself in a state of society in which the interconnection of social labor expresses or manifests itself as the private exchange of the individual products of labor is precisely the exchange value of these products." I'm going to unpack this, so don't worry if you didn't get it. So the elements of this natural law of value are that all societies must produce more or less continuously in order to survive or live. All societies must produce a quantity of differing products, satisfy a quantity of differing needs. All societies must involve a proportional distribution of total social labor to these products. In sum, this proportional distribution of total social labor to needs is the natural law of value. In other words, value is the quantity of total social labor relative to needs. Marx makes a fundamental distinction then between this natural law and the social form in which it exists. Natural laws apply to all socio-historical forms. They're trans-social, trans-historical. They're not abolished in the change from one form, social form, to another. And we could add, in fact, that natural laws do not exist except historically. This does not mean that natural laws are mental abstractions, but rather that they are a substance out of which forms are made, these forms constituting historical social modes of the existence of these natural laws. Marx's letter illustrates his distinction of natural law from its social form by reference to exchange value. In a society in which products are produced and distributed as private property, the natural law of value takes the social form of exchange value. And note the somewhat paradoxical character of this social form. Exchange becomes the social form of value because the production of products takes place as private property. In other words, because the products are produced as private property, their relation to society as a whole demands and is reduced to their exchange. Marx offers no other example of social form in this letter, but there must be others, otherwise exchange value would become effectively natural or transhistorical. Elsewhere, Marx suggests that an alternative would be a society based on common or public property instead of private property. And such a society would not need to rely on exchange in order to distribute total social labor to needs. It could do so through more direct social means, such as planning or whatever else, in fact. I can't recall Marx giving a name to this social form of value as such, besides his references to communism, but I'll venture to call it common value, or as opposed to exchange value. Note that according to this distinction of natural law from social form, this common value would also be an historical social form, not a natural law, so it would not constitute a kind of end of history, as is often claimed. Now, if we bear all this in mind when considering Marx's critique of political economy, it becomes clear that, as he says, it's not concerned with proving a law of value. Rather, it treats this law as true and then tries to demonstrate how it takes the social form that it does. In other words, Capital, the book, attempts to answer the question of how a society can live, how it can organize the labor it requires to produce the products it needs when property is privately owned and socialized through exchange. We consider Marx's analysis of the form of the commodity, then. A commodity is the social form a product takes when it is private property but put up for exchange. Marx describes the commodities having two elements, use value and exchange value. Use value refers to the quality of a product capable of satisfying a need, but as private property, the satisfaction of this need must involve the transfer of its ownership. If it were not exchanged, it could not be used and would have no value. Not because it would become useless, but because it would not be socially distributed. Exchange value, on the other hand, refers most obviously to what other commodities or money could be exchanged for a commodity. But these amounts do not make obvious the social form of exchange value. And Marx's illumination of this concerns the strange existence of exchange value, the fact that it results from an activity of exchanging commodities in which the concrete labor and concrete use composing production and consumption of the commodity are abstracted or withdrawn in order to reveal an immaterial commensuration or similarity or equality between two different material products. The point here is not just that exchange value is strange or abstract, but that this is the social form of value. This abstraction hereby becomes the object of an analysis of social form, which poses the question, how does this abstraction constitute exchange value and provide a form through which a society can live? The answer to this question concerns the proportional distribution constituted in and by the abstraction of exchange value. In simple exchange between two commodities, a proportion is established between them, equating the labor that produced them and the needs they satisfy. This is a relation of value, not because it concerns desire or respect or perhaps meaning, but because it concerns a proportion of different private labors and their allocation to needs. Note, this proportion may appear disproportionate, a drink of water in the desert exchanged for all my worldly possessions, but it is a proportion nonetheless. Exchange as such, the act of exchange, abstracts from the kind and amount of labor and uses involved. This is not necessarily thought of when you're thinking about using that product that you're exchanging, but in the act of exchange, that specific investment in the products, if you like, is abstracted from. This is the argument anyway. These proportions only become actually or more moderately proportional in an ideal market where there is a choice between a plenitude of similar products. And Marx presupposed such a market as a working axiom in his critique of political economy, even though it didn't exist. This rudimentary abstraction, then, and its proportionality in the exchange of two commodities becomes generalized with the emergence of money in its crude and pure forms, with the isolation of one commodity as an exchange commodity, such as gold, or with purely conventional money, the range of commodities included in the abstract proportion of exchange expands until it includes everything that can be bought with money. Thus, a purchase with money effectively establishes a proportional distribution between the product bought and everything else that can be bought with the same amount of money. It is in this way that money is an inherent potential of a society based on property. In so money enables the general exchange of all products needed by society when they are privately owned. Marx sought to demonstrate that the price of products is determined by the abstract labor time contained within them. And again, this presupposes an ideal market in which scarcity would not override this determination. But in any case, exchange remains the final judge of the value of abstract labor. If the products are not sold, they become worthless or valueless. Thus, the value of abstract labor is retrospectively given value by exchange. However, if we approach Marx's account of abstract labor in terms of the law of value, it is clear that he presupposed that value is a proportion of labor, and then sought to demonstrate how this appears as exchange value. The fact that this appearance is obscure or even invisible in prices does not mean that it does not exist. Marx's concept of capital is irreducible to his concepts of exchange value or commodity or money. He defines it as self-valorizing value. In other words, capital is exchange value in the form of its accumulation of value, so-called surplus value. Capital is therefore a process through which the capacity of labor to make more value than it costs is exploited and accumulated as private property. Capital or surplus value cannot be explained sufficiently by exchange value itself in an ideal market, since this presupposes an exchange of equivalent values, the axiom of an ideal market, and therefore those accumulation. If they're equally exchanged, there's no surplus. Marx then explains surplus value without abandoning this presupposition by demonstrating that it derives from the exploitation of labor outside the market in the private property of the capitalist work process. From the perspective of the social form of value, it is clear that this hidden source of value is already presupposed by the natural law of value as a proportional distribution of total social labor to needs, an increase and accumulation of value can never be anything else than a greater productivity of labor. This law of value also explains why Marx does not attribute value creation to distribution itself or circulation. Thus, capital is the social form that the increase in wealth takes in a society determined by exchange value. Capital is, therefore, a social form of society's growth. And insofar as capital is the motivation for social reproduction in general, the need for society to continuously produce for its needs, as opposed to the slow death of simply holding on to money, capital becomes the form of social life itself. Marx even describes capital as a life process. Insofar as capital involves the association of workers in the production process, capital is also social in a more direct and substantial form than the exchange value of private property of individual producers. And it's this socialization of labor that takes place within the capitalist accumulation process that Marx thought made it ripe for another social form of value. Okay, so insofar as, let's turn to art now, or try to. Insofar as art is a product of labor corresponding to a need, it should be subject to the natural law of value. Applied to art, this law would concern the proportional distribution of total social labor to the production of products, artworks that satisfy total artistic needs. This could be applied to art alone, as if it was a sub-society, but the suggestion is that art would be considered as one form of labor. But insofar as art is considered as not requiring the production of a product, for example, the idea that art is merely the consciousness of a product or of nature, the consciousness of any product, if you like, then art would not be subject to the law of value. Marx's conception of ideology concerns this consciousness, and as such, ideology is not directly determined by the law of value. But ideology is not, therefore, independent. Insofar as this law determines the products of a society, and as a consequence, the form of society in general, and insofar as ideology concerns the consciousness of this social being, then the non-social consciousness of social products is rendered illusory. Consciousness is determined socially, if you like. And so is the consciousness of pure nature, insofar as nature only appears through society. So in some ways, the image of pure nature is a peculiar social artifice. Marx's treatment of art as ideology suggests that he treats it as a form of consciousness, which is more or less conscious of a society structured by the law of value. And as such, art would join ideology in a superstructural sphere, conscious of an infrastructural economy of value. However, he also recognized art as a product satisfying needs, and to this extent, his conception of art as ideology is wrong or must be fundamentally qualified. Okay, so this really just concerns art in relationship to the law of value. So how about in relationship to the social form of value, and particularly exchange value? In terms of the social form that is exchange value, we are faced with applying a form analysis to the value of art, effectively. Again, this only concerns art insofar as it is treated as a product of labor satisfying a need, not pure consciousness. This task could be formulated as a question: is the social form of artworks determined by their production as private property and their distribution through exchange value? And insofar as the answer to this question is yes, then how are artworks so determined? I think it's evident that artworks are indeed so determined. This is not true of all artworks, but the exceptions do not seem to undermine the rule. Artworks are pervasively given the form of private property. Artworks are generally considered the property of their maker or the proprietor of the production process, where this involves other makers from which the artwork results. How they are private property is generally inscribed in the natural title of ownership, ascribed to their maker or proprietor. The history of artistic authorship is no more trans-historical than private property, and seems to evolve as part of the historical evolution of private property itself. An apparently exceptional form of artistic authorship concerns the degree to which it is inscribed within the artwork itself, the idea that the artwork is an extension of the artist's body. This effectively renders the artwork inalienable private property. But this is true of all private property insofar as it remains private. Artworks produced as private property often become used by others through their exchange. According to the strict conditions of Marx's understanding of exchange, this requires a transfer of ownership and consumption as the private property of the new owner. Artworks appear to be an exception insofar as they are not consumed, but it can be maintained that their use is their consumption. Artworks also appear to be an exception insofar as their use in that tools are used, but their experience is the satisfaction of a need, and in this sense, not exceptional to that of the use of tools. Finally, some artworks appear to be an exception because they are enduring. But just about all artworks would be consumed by nature alone without additional labor of conservation. Nonetheless, these qualities of artworks do enable them to be owned privately without being consumed only by the owner. Hence, they can exist in public exhibitions while remaining private property. But this does not constitute common property, evidently, unless the title of ownership is given up to an institution of common property, if in fact such an institution exists. Where artworks are part of an exchange of private property, they are subjected to the abstraction of their concrete production and consumption in this exchange, just like any other object of exchange. And this abstraction forms the exchange value of the artwork, that is, the proportional distribution of labor to need. Artworks appear to be exceptional by virtue of the intensive concretion or originality of their production and consumption. But this is suspended in the act of exchange, just as with any other commodity, which is also concrete. The prices of artworks can be exceptionally disproportionate to the labor time that produced them, but this is also the case in non-ideal markets for any other commodities. The market for some artworks is exceptional only in the sense that it is not ideal. That is, the originality demanded of artworks makes them inherently scarce, therefore suspending the plenitude of comparable commodities required for an ideal market. But clearly, many commodities are also sold under non-ideal conditions. Insofar as artworks are exchanged for money, their exchange value is expressed in the form of a general equivalent to all other commodities purchasable at this price. However disproportionate, this is the exchange value of the abstract artistic labor producing the product. It is worth much, much more or much less than average labor. In terms of the general proportion of labor to needs, artworks are simply massively overpriced or occasionally massively underpriced. These disproportions are equally true of non-ideal markets, and there are more ideal markets for artworks. Through unlimited editions, the disproportion reduces. Note that when we consider the labor invested in an artwork, it is often wrong to reduce this to the labor invested in literally making the object. Artworks are consumed often as a conglomerate, a combination of different labors: exhibition and installation labor, publication labor, performance labor, theoretical labor, etc. These all go towards producing the artwork as it is consumed. They are not necessarily exchanged or paid for, and they do not necessarily add up to an average valuation of labor, but they do effectively constitute labor that is productive of the use value of an artwork. The fact that art is exchanged as private property does not make it a capitalist enterprise, insofar as the latter requires not only private property exchange, but also the accumulation of exchange value through increasing the productivity of labor. Insofar as art does this, it can become a capitalist enterprise, and artists become capitalists. Some artworks are not the product of capitalist enterprise, despite being commodities. But one would need to make non-capital a criterion of what is art in order to generalize this into a definition of art as such. The idea that an artist cannot be a capitalist insofar as he is an individual producer and so cannot exploit himself is something Marx would agree to. But I think this mistakes capitalist and worker for real people rather than, as Marx said, personifications of economic functions. And I cannot see why these personifications need to subsume the whole of a real person. One can be a capitalist in the morning, a worker in the afternoon, a hoarder of money in the evening. To recap then, there are a number of ways in which one can prevent an artwork being determined by the social form of exchange value, despite it being produced as private property. It cannot be exchanged or sold. It could be given away to someone else without exchange, transferring it into another person's private property. Its social existence would therefore be limited to this exchange and otherwise remain within the private sphere of the benefactor. Or it could be given to an exceptional institution of common property, insofar as one exists. But note that all these options require that the person does not need to live from exchanging their art. Insofar as they did, they would not survive for more than a few weeks. I would just like to emphasize that the exceptions to the rule that can be generated within a society of exchange value should be differentiated strictly from the production of artworks according to another social form of value, say a society of common property or common value. And in terms of this social form, we must ask the fundamentally different question. Is art determined by a social form of common property or common value, or how is art determined by such a social form?
Okay. David Beech.
Hello. Very, very pleased to be here. Thank you to everyone for making this possible, and especially thank you to the translators who've been amazing throughout. I'm going to talk about some of the key ideas in my book, Art and Value, which came out last year in hardback. That costs €130. It's coming out in paperback very, very soon, and it'll just cost €15. So hold on to your seats. And I want to talk a little bit about why I wrote that book and how I wrote that book before summarizing some of its key points. I wrote that book partly out of anger. I tend to do quite a lot of things out of anger, and this was one of them where I was angry at the assumption and the constant iteration of the idea that art is a commodity like anything else. That art's relationship to capitalism is the same as any productive activity's relationship to capitalism. It just didn't feel right to me. It didn't feel true to my experience of art as an artist. Now, what I then did was I began writing a book which took on essentially Marxist critical theory on its own terms. So in other words, I wrote a whole book which interrogated the Marxist concept of commodification through exactly the same methodology that critical theorists were using when they were writing about art's commodification. So, and after finishing that book, I dismissed it. I rejected it straight away. And I kind of realized after writing that book that I needed to write with a different methodology not just to counter the argument, but to actually present a different kind of argument. And what I realized at that point was I had to teach myself economics. All right, and it took quite a few years to do that. I did write another book whilst I was teaching myself economics, which I then rejected because by the time I'd finished finding out about economics, I realized that I'd made a lot of mistakes in the second draft of the book. So the book actually was like the third version itself. And what I ended up doing was two things, and the book is in two parts. The first part, what I did was I went to the British Library and I took out, or sat in with, every key book in economics throughout the whole history of economics. And I went through it, not to read economics, but initially to see if they mentioned art. And so so I started with Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, and I read through the whole book, and he doesn't mention art. And I thought, oh, this is a terrible idea. But then, when I read Jean-Baptiste Say and David Ricardo, they did mention art, and I thought, oh, maybe this isn't such a bad idea. So then I read through the whole history of economics and found out what they thought about art. And what they all argued was that art was economically exceptional. So that became something for me to look into. In what way is art economically exceptional? And the subtitle to my book, Art and Value, is Art Economic in Classical, Neoclassical and Marxist Economics. What I do in the first part of the book is to write a summary of the various ways in which classical economists regarded art as exceptional, as not being subject to the laws of supply and demand, and why art is not subject to the laws of supply and demand. All based on, I mean, for them, the symptom, the thing that caused them to worry about whether art was a standard commodity or not, was its high prices. Why would something that costs only £5 to make sell for £10,000? That, from a classical economist point of view, that just doesn't make any sense. So they looked into it, and they came up with theories about why art prices do not conform to the laws of supply and demand. Then I go on to look at neoclassical economics, which denies that there is such a thing as anything economically exceptional. And then what I do is I find that there are specific exceptions to neoclassical price theory within art. And then in the second part of the book, what I do is I look at Marx's theory of the commodity, Marx's theory of value, Marx's theory of the capitalist mode of production, and trace to what extent art either conforms or fails to conform to those theories. So I'm not an economist, but I've ended up writing this book with a lot of economics in it. And I'm kind of quite quickly forgetting a lot of the economics that went into the book. Because what I was really interested in was what you do next. The reason I wrote the book was to provide a new platform for thinking about art's relationship to capitalism. And the book just provides the platform. So what I want to do now is to think about, if we take that as a basis, that art is economically exceptional, not that art is commodified, then how might we address art politically? In other words, if art has not been commodified in the way that industrial production and so forth has, then where are the points of weakness? Where do we find our enemies? Where do we aim our critique? If it operates differently, then we can't just fight it as if it operates in the same way. So, some of the interesting ways in which art demonstrates or indicates that it is economically exceptional can be observed in very straightforward ways. Like there is no job market for artists. Okay, when I left college with my art degree and I wanted to become an artist, and I went to sign on to claim unemployment benefit, they asked me what kind of job I was looking for, and I couldn't say I'm looking for a job as an artist because those jobs are not available. So you have to pretend you're looking for a job. You have to look first of all. What I did was I moved to Manchester because there were no jobs there. So they were going to leave me alone. I could be an artist. But there is no job market for artists. And economists have realised that there is something strange here. Even economists like David Throsby, who's a neoclassical stroke borderline neoliberal economist, who is a leader in what he calls cultural economics, and therefore is constantly saying that art is a commodity like everything. When an artist gets a pay rise, is they reduce the number of hours that they do in their job, because they use the extra money to supplement their time making art. So he calls this self-subsidy. All right, to make it economic again. All right, but the word perverse sticks in my mind anyway. Artists are economically irrational, which isn't the same as being irrational. It might in fact be more rational than being economically rational. I'm talking about artists here, and I'm talking about artistic labour because for a Marxist this is the fundamental way of deciding what kind of economic process are you looking at. Start with the labour. And if you look at historically the transition from a feudal economy, from a feudal mode of production to the capitalist mode of production, okay, it typically goes through two stages according to Marx. The first is the what he calls the formal subsumption of labour under capital, which is basically turning, for instance, a peasant into a wage labourer. So they carry on doing the same work that they did before, but now they get paid a wage. And that's a formal subsumption of their labour under capital, which is to say that they now have an economic relationship to you, rather than some other custom-based relationship or coercive-based relationship. And then the second phase he calls the real subsumption of labour under capital. And the real subsumption of labour under capital is when the labour itself is transformed according to the needs of capitalism, which is to say it becomes more efficient, it gets divided up into simple operations, it becomes augmented by technology, it becomes subject to scientific principles, so on and so forth. So the labour itself is transformed by its relationship to capitalism, because the capitalist here is in control. Now, if you look at what happened to artists over that same period, what happened is that artists didn't go from being peasants to wage labourers. They went from being artisans to artists. So before the capitalist mode of production, we didn't have the concept of artist that we have now. But artist is not a category of wage labour. In fact, within the literature at the time, it's very clear that the concept of artist is in opposition to the concept of wage labour. So if we look at the labour and its relationship to capital, then artistic labour was never transformed by the emergence of the capitalist mode of production. And it still hasn't become an instance of the capitalist mode of production. It is exceptional. Marx calls it transitional. He says that there was this, during this period, and this massive period of transition, there were transitional forms of labor. Certain kinds of independent handicraft producers who are not workers because they own their own means of production and they sell their products rather than sell their labor. They're not capitalists because they're the workers rather than the people who just enter into production through the supply of capital and then leave production by taking out more than they put in. So these transitional independent handicrafts people were transitional, and art remained transitional even after the transition, and that's exceptional. So, how long have I got?
I was thinking about what you were saying, like 6 minutes.
6 minutes, okay. So, I just want to go back a little bit and talk about Adam Smith for a second. Just, I find his explanation of art exceptionalism, although he doesn't mention art isn't one of in his terms, but all subsequent theories of art's exceptionalism in economics derive from Adam Smith's description of the high prices of certain fine wines. Okay, so Adam Smith is wondering about why certain bottles of wine cost much more than it costs to produce them. Where does this extra come from? And he says that there are certain conditions for the production of wine, which is to do with the territory and the climate and so on and so forth, which cannot be extended no matter how much people want more of that wine. So he says that there's a situation in which supply cannot be met. And the more that people understand how good this wine is, the more knowledge there is about this wine, the more demand there is, but supply cannot meet it. And so, he says, the usual laws of supply and demand don't work because they only work if supply can be increased to meet demand, at which point you get an equilibrium price. You get the price matching the value. With rare wines, the price does not match the value. The price is greater than the value of the wine because the price is determined by the, let's see if I can find the phrase. He says, when the quantity of any commodity which is brought to market falls short of the effectual demand, all those who are willing to pay the whole value of the rent, wages, and profit, which must be paid in order to bring it thither, cannot be supplied with the quantity which they want, rather than want it altogether, that is, rather than go without it. Some of them, some people in the marketplace, will be willing to give more than its value. A competition will ensue, and the market price will rise more or less above the natural price, according to either the greatness of the deficiency or the wealth and wanton luxury of the competitors. So in other words, exceptional goods have these extraordinary prices because there's not enough of it to go around, and people then get into a competition amongst themselves over who will pay for it. And the competition is expressed through increases in price. So this becomes the basis of thinking about economic exceptionalism for classical economists. And Jean-Baptiste Say adds art to the list. So there's rare wine, rare coins, artworks, and Jean-Baptiste Say adds something. So he's not just trying to explain natural exceptional good, like wine, the vineyard being having a natural limit. When he's trying to explain why a painting goes for such high prices, he needs to come up with an equivalent of this limit. And he says that the limit is talent. So the reason that artworks sell price is because we can increase the amount of artists. This becomes a kind of natural monopoly. I know, I teach for a living. So David Ricardo created a much tighter definition, but other than that, didn't really extend the theory. It's certainly the clearest definition of exceptionalism. But then Nassau Senior, in 1836, added another explanation that Jean-Baptiste Say didn't include. And he says one of the reasons why artworks sell for such high prices is because of the death of artists. So if you take the idea, which is expressed best by Ricardo, that these prices are high because their quantity cannot be increased by production. So we can't add to the supply to meet demand through production. These cannot be reproduced. Then Nassau Senior's argument about death is almost like the perfect example of how it's not possible to increase supply to meet demand because the producer is dead. But of course, all of this is based on certain assumptions, practices, theories, and norms associated with artistic practice. In other words, the death of the artist is only operative if we have the belief that each artist produces individual work that expresses them, that nobody else can reproduce without it being theirs, and so on and so forth. So artistic production must already be framed in a kind of romantic way in order for these exceptionalisms to have any force whatsoever. Okay? So in calling them romantic, I'm not for 1 minute thinking we can just do away with them. I don't think that they're wrong and irrational in that sense. I think that they're very specific and they've got their own histories. But to understand art's economic exceptionalism, we also have to understand how art was reconceived during the period of transition from feudalism to capitalism. And if we don't understand that reconception, that shift from the artisan to the artist, then we won't really understand where these exceptions come from. And again, in saying that, I'm following Marx by saying it's the mode of production that is key here. In other words, the theory of commodification, and just very quickly, the theory of commodification was first developed in 1974 by different Marxists writing in different places all at the same time. It's very odd. I've not explained that. I don't understand that. But that's when the theory of commodification is developed. And in all three instances, the theory of commodification is an application of a kind of a sociological version of Marxism applied to culture. It's very interesting that our concept of commodification was invented to describe something to do with art. And it's based on exchange. It's based on looking at how artworks are bought and sold and exchanged for money and have a value and so on and so forth. And Marx had already condemned that exercise by saying that what determines something as a commodity is not how it's exchanged, but how it's produced. And what determines something as a commodity is that it is produced for exchange. In other words, and Marx talks in very colourful ways about this, the capitalist producer has no interest in the commodities they produce. They don't have to like them, they don't have to want them, they don't have to have any use for them. Their entire use is that these are a means by which they will make a profit. So, you know, there are very famous examples of capitalists who've admitted this, and it's been very troublesome for their businesses when they've said, oh yeah, we produce rubbish. I would never be seen dead with my stuff. I would never wear the clothes that I sell. Therefore, other people. But this is actually something that Marx understood very early on, is that there is a discontinuity between use value and exchange value within capitalist production, within capitalist commodity production. For something to be made for exchange is for you not to have an interest in it. And clearly, art is exceptional in that regard. Artists take more than an interest in what they do. Artists are... it's possible for artists, for instance, to increase the volume of the works that they were going to produce anyway, because they've got demand. But it's scandalous, and this is important because we're talking, as I said before, about art's economic exceptionalism is related to norms around art and artistic production. If it's scandalous for artists to produce things without having any interest in the things that they produce, if it kind of feels like that's not art, or that they're somehow okay. I thought it said pain. It says 1 min. So if that's scandalous, then that's part of the basis, the normative basis of art's economic exceptionalism. And so when we talk about art's economic exceptionalism, when I wrote the book, I tried to, as much as I possibly could, to give an economic account, not a normative account of art's economic exceptionalism. Because what I didn't want to do is to get involved in that kind of pre-Raphaelite, romantic defense of art against money and capital and capitalists. Because that doesn't give us a new platform for thinking about this. What I wanted to do was to find the kind of the economic conditions for us to be able to argue for art as not being a commodity. Nevertheless, underneath that, what that must be based on is a whole set of norms which we have developed since the 18th century, and possibly even earlier in some respects, about artistic labour and its relationship to freedom, social freedom, to issues around authenticity and selfhood, to in some respects ethics. You know, Schiller, for instance, when he theorizes artistic production, he talks about nobility. You know, these norms which are introduced to try to understand what makes artistic labour different from wage labour are absolutely essential to us thinking about its economics. But of course, that opens up a whole set of other questions, which maybe we'll get into, and maybe we'll say another day. Thank you.
Vamos un poquitito tarde, entonces voy a hacer una trampita, que voy a plantear una cosa, después voy a invitar a Brenda y a los demás ponentes a que tengan una discusión entre ellos, y después vamos a abrir preguntas al público. Creo que las diferentes posiciones son más o menos claras, que tenemos 4 versiones diferentes del mismo tema. Lo único que yo quiero acotar es que estoy muy agradecida con nuestros ponentes porque siento que está funcionando muy bien esta combinación de posturas. Mi intención de invitarlos a ellos a que vinieran a hablar de sus respectivos contextos era que fuera como cuando alguien va a visitar a tu familia y entonces te dice algo de su familia y tú te das cuenta de cosas que están pasando en tu familia. Es una cosa de quién fue una discusión útil. Espero que se haya notado que en las diferencias de posturas, por ejemplo, está la pregunta: si nosotros consideramos que el valor de la obra es producto de un medio, el curador es parte del valor de la obra, el galerista es parte del valor de la obra, el SITAC es parte del valor de la obra, el crítico que escribe gratis es valor de la obra, el maestro de la escuela de arte que cobra muy poco es parte del valor de la obra. Nosotros tenemos una idea muy distinta de lo que implica, por ejemplo, la profesionalización del medio. Nosotros llevamos años hablando de profesionalización y en términos de legislación, si estamos hablando de profesionalización, estamos hablando de la creación de un mercado donde se reconoce la aportación de esos agentes al valor. Y entonces, para aterrizar todo muy claro es: nosotros vamos a ir con el gobierno o con el patrocinador privado y le vamos a decir: ok, está bien que le des dinero a las galerías, porque darle dinero a las galerías aporta al valor de la obra. Y entonces nosotros somos profesionales, artistas profesionales, en la medida en que producimos mercancías. Eso es una de las posturas que ha quedado clarísima la diferencia. Entonces nosotros vamos a tener una política pública que entienda la profesionalización del medio como la conversión del artista y de todo el medio cultural en una forma de una máquina de producción capitalista. Y eso es una cosa que sí se está decidiendo y que sí se está debatiendo ahorita, más allá de si fuiste a la marcha o no fuiste. Otra pregunta: te van a dar cuando te den una beca o cuando te den un apoyo de una fundación privada, tú vas a tener que entregar una lista de la población que favoreciste y por qué la favoreciste. Vamos a tener que tener, por ejemplo, cuotas, si pensamos en lo que planteaba Pascal, vamos a tener que tener cuotas de poblaciones minoritarias favorecidas por determinados proyectos sociales, y eso lo vamos a estar midiendo. Entonces, sí, nada más quiero que, aunque los términos son exactos, creo que lo que se está discutiendo aquí incide directamente sobre las intenciones de las políticas tanto públicas como privadas. Y esto también es algo que le comento a los ponentes esperando que se refleje en la discusión entre ellos. Y invito a nuestros otros ponentes y a Brenda Caro, y yo ya no voy a decir nada. Yo me voy al rincón. Tú quédate al centro y ponlos a discutir entre ellos.
Bueno, yo quisiera poder empezar a abrir esta discusión. Creo que uno de los puntos que a mí me parece como bastante crítico y que es necesario plantear ahorita retomando un poco lo que decía Dave, de este cambio importante de artesano a artista. ¿Qué sucede, por ejemplo, y retomando también un poco lo que señala Pilar, de poder ver cómo esta discusión acerca de producción del valor está incidiendo de manera más directa de lo que podría pensarse? ¿Qué sucede, por ejemplo, cuando me gustaría que pusiéramos a discusión cuando el cambio, estamos hablando artesano, artista, y ahora tenemos al trabajador de la cultura, o tenemos al empresario cultural, o tenemos al capital humano, que somos el talento, capital humano, el artista? O sea, cuando el artista es esta especie de capital humano, o sea, su capital es su talento, ¿no? Y cómo eso es de alguna manera utilizado, por ejemplo, desde perspectivas de política pública, de decir por qué voy a valorar o no voy a valorar el apoyo a un determinado proyecto, ¿no? O incluso desde yo como digamos, agente, parte de la sociedad civil, sea desde el ámbito privado, de las ONGs o de otras instancias no dependientes de la administración gubernamental, también voy estructurando una agenda y sobre todo me parece importante poder ver, poner a discusión con ustedes, sobre todo porque este valor que se le está dando desde el punto de vista económico y simbólico, esta idea de lo creativo, de la creatividad, ¿no? Pensando, por ejemplo, ciudades creativas, todos vamos a ser empresarios culturales, ¿no? Ahora todos podemos aplicar al empresariado cultural y así vamos a solucionar nuestro problema de financiamiento de producción de la obra, ¿no? Estoy siendo irónica a propósito. O, por ejemplo, esta cosa fabulosa de la economía naranja, de vamos a hacer creatópolis y todos vamos a ser creativos y vivir felices en la creatividad, o incluso un poco la postura que señalaba Pascal, que me parece problemática, aunque suena muy bien, pero problemática respecto a pensar que, no pensar que, o el pensar que la cultura está en la base de todo, que con eso nos vamos a escapar a los usos utilitarios de la cultura, ¿no? Y cómo se le está, como esos usos utilitarios de la cultura también están reafirmando condiciones de precariedad y de inequidad social. Entonces, me gustaría como empezar por ahí, no sé si Marina, tú quisieras abundar.
I mean, I guess it seems like part of what you're pointing to is what's the kind of effectiveness of these various fictions or ideologies of value, and where it becomes important, how whether it exists, so to speak, or not, and like how it operates, even if we can maybe agree it only has a rhetorical kind of existence, perhaps. What's the kind of effect of that fiction? And I suppose there is a kind of speculative proposition that wants to think about the effects of taking it seriously in this idea that Pascal proposed, right? This kind of culture as being both more encompassing and more fundamental at the same time. So it loses its borders, but it's also consolidated. And I guess what can be the sort of politics of appropriating that as a politics versus seeing how it operates as a kind of general vehicle of kind of devalorization and immiseration under the banner of creativity or kind of the diffusion of culture. So I'm sorry if it just sounds like I'm paraphrasing what you just said, just thinking through it. But I guess also in my work, didn't speak about it today, but kind of thinking about this idea of human capital and the artist as a kind of avatar of human capital, and then really what does that mean? Like, how do you separate? Because the thing with human capital is there's no separation possible between the legal owner and and the matter of accumulation or investment, which would be the capital. So you can understand labor power as a commodity that someone, fictionally owns or can alienate, even though it's a violent fiction. It's also often a non-operative fiction. But the idea of human capital itself, it's kind of simply even kind of less basis for that fiction, because capital kind of is a category of legal ownership that doesn't operate on the basis, if you take an individual at its basis, because they can't make a shell company of themselves. That would be like another Panama Papers development. But yes, I guess it would be more like, if it's obviously a kind of absurd concept, how does it operate? And that's why I kind of started looking into Gary Becker, and how Foucault was talking about Gary Becker, and how Gary Becker thought this was an emancipatory concept because it allows us to kind of, if we can economically, it's the kind of classical, or not classical, but the neoliberal thing is, if it can be valued, like value is one metric, and it incorporates ethics, norms, economics, et cetera, and it needs to be applied to everything. If we know how to value it properly, it will become socially effective properly, or recognized properly. So I think value of recognition and visibility is part of the terminology of things like human capital, social capital, cultural capital. But I think it's obviously also important to unpack the kind of extreme sort of both absurdity but also violence.
Dave, ¿cuál sería, por ejemplo, esto que se señala, Marina, y esta revisión histórica que realizaste acerca de estas variaciones sobre la forma en cómo esta excepcionalidad del arte? Porque creo que algo que es interesante es como si la excepcionalidad alguna vez partió del artista, o más bien de la obra de arte como unicidad, ahora creo que la excepcionalidad parte de esta idea del capital creativo, ¿no? Del artista como estos que señalaste, o sea, como de la individualidad del artista, de esta cualidad de unicidad, ¿no? No tanto de la unicidad de la obra, sino del artista como este productor único. No sé si me explico, ¿no? Entonces, sí, a partir de ahí.
Yeah. First of all, I just want to point out that economic exceptionalism is not restricted to art and to artists. Footballers are sold at fancy prices. Classical economists call them fancy prices. That the production of them doesn't cost as much as their price is higher than their value. So I don't want to kind of make it seem as if artists are completely unusual in this respect. In fact, William Baumol, who's a kind of neoclassical stroke welfare economist, he's written about what he calls the cost disease, and we've talked about this before. And the cost disease is when you cannot make the labour more efficient through technology and the division of labour, and therefore, whilst everything else gets cheaper to produce, this thing stays at the same price or gets more and more expensive relatively. So the cost disease affects things like nursing, because you need a person to do this in real time. It affects watch repairs, which is why now it's become economically rational to throw your old watch away when it's broken and buy a brand new one, because it costs so much to get someone to repair it, because now repairs cost more than the production of the original object. Masseurs, anything to do with hospitality, bus drivers, so exceptionalism of various kinds can be attached to different kinds of things, and things that seem to have no relationship to each other, like bus drivers and professional footballers. So when we're talking about artists as being unique producers and their objects being unique, and here I'd like to mention something that Stewart said earlier on. Stewart said that just because artworks are concrete, and that their concreteness is part of what they are, doesn't make them any different from commodities, because all commodities are concrete. Well, the issue economically is not to do with them being concrete, it's to do with whether they are substitutable. So the only way you can get a market that has supply and demand that operates in the standard way is if this bottle is substitutable with this bottle. In other words, I can make 500 of these, and then if the demand is for 600, I'll make another 100. They're substitutable. Each bottle can be substituted for any other bottle. And what economists have argued in relation to art is that they're not substitutable. Even two paintings of the same landscape by the same artist on the same day are not substitutes of one another. They're different paintings, and they might go for different prices. One might be better than the other. One might be more important than the other for some reason. So one might be more adventurous than the other. So the non-substitutability of individual artworks makes them economically exceptional, but also, and this is to answer your question, I'm sorry it took me so long to get there, artists are not substitutable either, and that's what is at the basis of this. And it's not that other people are incapable of producing the same things that you've produced, so that someone can make copies, or someone can use your methodology and your technique and produce things which are the same or more or less the same. But they will be theirs, not yours. And it's that narrative of the relationship between the producer and the product that is the crucial element in the non-substitutability of artworks and artists. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but what I think is that what, let's say, blunt neoliberalism also, or capitalism, tries to do is make everything substitutable by quantifying, by talking, for example, about human capital. It's a very strange definition about, it's quantifying humans. That's what it is about. It's trying to put a measure on what a human life or a human behavior is worth. That's quantifying. When you quantify things, they are exchangeable. And you can say this word is that. So this is the whole rhetorics of quantifying, and the idea that you can quantify everything is. And now I come back to also I think the critique of trying to put culture on the base. It is a way of signifying things. It is signifying things, for example, by talking about human capital again, signifying things in a quantifying way, and doing as if this is evident. I don't think this is evident. We have to reject this. This is the first thing, and also to reject this language even. This is, for me, very important. And now to the non-substitutable, what for me is important, I think there are a lot of things which are not substitutable. And maybe it's not artists themselves, but there are practices which are very difficult to quantify. I always use the blunt example of love. You not can buy love. When you do this, it's finished. What you do is in a course. It is, and this is what is, I think, market thinking or neoliberal thinking is trying to destroy or avoid in this whole system. So this is for me very important, to put culture at the base. I mean, this is all way of signifying, and don't get in this trap by talking about human capital, because this is the same thing, what we are doing then at that moment.
Sorry, just a second. It's not trying to destroy it, it's trying to make a buck out of it. To make money. Because if you quantify it, you can make money out of it. It's the whole point of what we're discussing.
Yeah, but you have to avoid this, I think.
Vamos a abrir el público ya quiere opinar, entonces vamos a abrir las preguntas del público. Permítame un momento. Primero,
alguien que nos ayude y vamos poniendo.
Le doy la palabra a Stewart y abrimos ya preguntas del público.
Yeah, I would just like to say one comment in relationship to the points that have been made, and I think that. Okay. In some ways, I think that one of the fundamental questions here is whether exceptionality derives from a society of private property or orientates itself to a retention, reinforcement, nostalgia, defense of a society of private property, or whether it's orientated towards another kind of society, namely society of common property. And I think there are many ways in which art is exceptional, but a lot of these exceptionalities derive from a reinforcement of the artist as a private property owner. And this simply reconstitutes the fundamental social form of bourgeois social relations, in which there are only individuals, and the question becomes, how do these individuals make a society? How do they actually organize themselves, relate to one another and what they're doing in order to generate the things that they want to do and benefit from working together and so on, which doesn't mean just the irreducible insistence on their individuality. I agree with Dave about the distinction between concreteness and substitutability. And this is what I mean. I mean, the artwork's originality is an intensified form of concreteness. But the abstraction involved in exchange value is not to do with the fact that these products are the same. Okay? Exchangeability produces an equivalence between things that are different. Okay? I mean, in some ways, the idea that the equivalence is generated because the things look the same is exactly what Marx called fetishism of commodities. So, yeah.
Abrimos preguntas del público.
A ver,
había uno, dos,
tres, cuatro.
Okay. Does this work? Oh, okay, thanks. Well, a very stimulating set of panels and speakers. I wanted to, speculate on the basis of what Marina called the fictions. And, for example, the definitions of things like culture as value. If culture becomes the base or the mode of production or something approximating that, then we presumably would be moving into a new mode of production that would be characterized by things the kind of circulation that takes place on the internet, new kinds of relations that are pushing production in a very different way. Of course, we haven't moved into a different mode of production, but there's something emerging. If that is the case, then there may be something like culture or some other term that would be at the base of a mode of production. But then again, I'm not very much of a scientist and believe in scientific laws, so that I would take as the natural law a new mode of production called culture. But so that would be you know, I would have my skepticism about that. If that's the case, nevertheless, I would want to make an argument from that that would extrapolate use, in this case of art, different from what most of you have been talking about, which is value, right, as a social form of labor, or setting of price, which is largely what we're talking about, setting of price. That's why those works that are quote valueless, right, they've lost their price, right? But if we're moving to a different mode of production where private property is no longer a principle of capital, then we could focus on something like use, in which case we see a whole set of manifestations of art that seek to work in a different mode, right? Where it's the use. So, for example, it's the old conceptual issue of, you know, taking the ironing board or taking any work of art and using it as an ironing board. It's the use that is no longer determined, that's no longer set by private property. So I would be able to use art in many different ways, and the notion of the use and the rise of a user rather than a consumer of private property becomes a much more important issue. When that becomes the case, it seems that there's another issue on the table that I guess extrapolates from what Harvey called the art of rent, which is, let's say, the next step in Dave's account of Smith, right? About how fine wines get determined. When Harvey says, well, a whole new set of intermediaries and brokers, curators, whatever, begin talking in aesthetic terms about taste. And then you could have California wines and wines from anywhere begin to compete. And so in this world of what you could call a knowledge, cognitive, or affective economy, or cultural economy, the curatorship, that is, those people who are specialists in discussing the aesthetic values of things, the old thing, advertising in industry, begin to have a greater role. And what's interesting about that is that there's a whole set of manifestations of art that seek to move away from that don't want to deal with the curator, the art world, so on and so forth. That is why there's so much of attraction of a certain kind of artist for social movements. That is to almost collapse whatever the art process is with social movements, with 15M or Occupy or what have you, in seeking, I can't use the word anymore, value, because Marina sort of has made it, vaporized the use of value unless you use it in the scientific Marxist way. All the other ways, so you could talk about price, you could talk about use, right? And work with those in this emerging mode of production. So, I mean, that would be a scenario in which talking about art no longer just as an object that gets valued, but that the process gets focused on the use, right? And the use is not, it doesn't even carry price, right? Because the fact that I may be involved in a 15M demonstration as an artist doesn't have a price attached to it unless there's a documentation that's bought by a museum, so on and so forth, and a curator that gives it value. Then it goes into that Harvey-esque art of rent kind of issue. But I mean, I think that the situation we're on has moved beyond the exceptionalism of art and the fine wine example to a different stage.
Want to say anything? Some of you?
So you want to answer to continue discussion, or we?
Should we maybe collect some questions?
Yeah, some more questions. Okay. Otra pregunta por acá.
Los dos de acá.
Los dos de acá. Acá primero. primero el muchacho de la gorra, después el de la camisa roja. Perdón que les diga así, pero no sé quiénes son.
Yeah, well, I had a question for Marina. I already talked to her about it, but when Dave talked, I was like, I would like to make some clarifications first. I am most definitely sure that art is exceptional in several ways, but the way in which Dave was talking that art is exceptional goes beyond some really basic economic principles, which are preferences that justify rationality on individuals. If we, I would like to separate that first from setting aside any and all economic and financial considerations. If we wanted to value, and here's a hypothetical situation, if we were to value all works of art, not by financial or economical considerations, Marina, what would then give value to those things that most definitely have it and are subject to exposure, like those artworks that can no longer be insured and no longer have a price, but should be like presented. And within the economical context, the fact that that art is exceptional and violates certain assumptions that make them economically priceable is no longer, no longer renders art outside of the scope from economical analysis. There's this whole new branch of behavioral economics that goes in line with what you are proposing, not only taking outside of the language this kind of human and capital and stuff like that, but if you are going to value it, there's psychology and there's other perceptions. Yeah, there it goes.
Antes de que conteste Marina, solo una petición especial al público, sean bien concretos con sus preguntas. Si no es pregunta, sino un comentario, creo que después podemos tener como más tiempo para eso, para que nos dé chance de varias personas de participar. Ya. Gracias.
I mean, I guess kind of thinking of your question also with relation to what George was just saying, this kind of trying to sort of speculatively shift our paradigm, at least in a kind of anticipative or projective kind of way, to a form of social relationship where private property is not the main basis of, and which Stewart was also talking about, the main basis of how value is socially realized or socially effective. Also effective in that it underlies all the other ways we understand value, sort of, so to speak, in the last instance, which is maybe brings in the kind of whole creative economy thing back to the front. But I guess, yeah, if you had to think about other forms of valuation in another sort of social relationship between art and property, or perhaps it wouldn't be art anymore in any case. So what kind of function, what kind of relationships do specific kinds of objects make possible? That becomes, and then that's a kind of at the basis of what we understand by their value, I suppose. If you open up the question of value beyond property, it's like what social relationships have these objects emerged from, and what social relationships do they make possible, or what forms of thought do they make possible, what forms of material engagement, social engagement. So in that case, I guess, like also in just referring to the earlier conversation that we had, it would also, if it became a kind of a practical question about saving things, or kind of like how you realize value or realize care for kind of objects that have become redefined or recontextualized in other non-private property relations. It would also, their form perhaps would also be open to question. Like, for example, I think there's an exhibition at the moment called Making Use in Warsaw, which has kind of showing lots of different practices in terms, not in terms of showing objects, but kind of what they call reports. So kind of facsimiles or photocopies, or kind of results of carrying through an idea or a suggestion, or a kind of representative something which represents an idea to the extent that there can be a conversation around it. So I guess I would kind of think about those kinds of social relationships also being materialized differently when it comes to how value is understood or made socially effective in this other kind of situation where value is not tied to private property as the social basis of the production of abstract value, and where art fits into that.
Okay, yes, just quickly then. Yes, I'm trying to just clarify what Marx's theory of value is, and that includes clarifying its limits. And clearly there's a lot it doesn't account for a lot of things that attach to the word value, and I'm not trying to deny that. Certainly, I think, the use of things outside of monetary exchange of private property. I mean, that happens, that exists, that has value. You can call it value if you like. I mean, I have no objection. I mean, all I would really sort of say is that Marx's conception of value, in some ways, is orientated towards a society of wealth, an increase in use values, and a decrease in the labor that goes into producing them, producing free time, okay? And in some ways, his theory of value is orientated towards that kind of proportionality. How can we produce wealth, and how can we reduce the amount of labor it takes us to have what we want, okay? And I think that notion of value, that kind of orientation is important. There are plenty of politicians, plenty of economics, plenty of capitalists who spend all their time trying to generate a culture of scarcity, a culture of choice, competition, non-substitutability, or a kind of, basically a culture of scarcity. This is inherent. There's nothing exceptional about non-ideal markets. All capitalists are orientated to, which capitalist really tries to produce something which doesn't have some quality, some special dimension to it that will give it that kind of extra quality? I mean, that's big. Mass production, in a pure sense of standardized use values, is not a kind of norm of capitalist production, simply because it reduces profitability. So I think artworks are, exceptional, or they can be economically exceptional, but really there's nothing economically exceptional about their exceptionality, And what makes them exceptional can also make other commodities exceptional. And what makes other commodities non-exceptional can also be applied to art,
Okay. First of all, I think Stewart is confusing two meanings of the word exceptional. So when I talk about economic exceptionalism, I'm talking about anomalies to actual existing economic theories and economic practices. So when I'm talking about art exceptionalism, I mean that the theories do not account for what actually happens, or the standard patterns of circulation are not iterated within art's own forms of exchange. Also that Marx was very clear, and the best place to find this is in his critique of the Gotha program, that in the original Gotha program, the authors said that labor is the source of all value. And Marx said, this is absolutely ridiculous. Labor is... No, they didn't say that. They said value. And this is why... And Marx said, they're not the source of value, because nature is also the source of value. They're only the source of wealth, in other words, exchange value. There's other kinds of value which Marx thought were really important. And also, the distinction between use value and exchange value for Marx is the difference between something which is highly concrete. A use is not something that can be standardized. If somebody wants to use this bottle of water to throw it at somebody, that's a use value. If somebody wants to insert it in their body, that's a use value. all use values are completely concrete, completely individual, are completely perverse. Exchange values are the exact opposite of that. They're abstract and they're standard. And so Marx knew very clearly that use values were very, very important. And Marx distinguished the two kinds of exchange that I'm talking about in terms of exchange. So art is only owned by an artist because they made it. So that's not a bourgeois concept of private property. It predates bourgeois concepts of private property. Art can be owned, but it can also be owned by producing it. And just exactly the same. This is why I'm saying exceptionalism is not kind of a very narrow band of what we do. Art is as exceptional as baking a cake that you eat yourself.
Para poder, porque estamos súper colgados de tiempo, pero creo que hay muchas preguntas. Entonces, vamos a juntar todas las preguntas y hacen un cierre de esta manera nuestros ponentes. Entonces,
okay, yes, I want to apologize first of all for the stupidity of the question I'm going to make. I'm not very good in economics and so on. I was just wondering if in the making of value, or in the thing we call values nowadays, we're not confusing at times art and personality. There was this joke about Picasso in a restaurant making drawings, and the waiter take the napkin and he said, I don't want to buy the restaurant. And the case of the ready-made again, everybody can make a ready-made, there's nothing exceptional about that. But what makes the value of a ready-made piece? And the other thing is about reproducibility. Is photography an art form?
Okay, tenemos una pregunta por acá. Tres aquí abajo. Por favor. Mucho, ajá. 1, 2 y 3 y
bueno, primero que nada, pues, buenas tardes. Quiero hacer una pregunta que va con dos enfoques. El primero es acerca de las ponencias. Estamos viendo algo acerca de valor y quiero una pregunta dirigida a esta idea de lo que tenemos como valor. En el mundo de las artes, el productor, veámoslo así, el artista, tiene algo que se llama intención. Y hablando de estas intenciones de producción, hay otra cosa que es la intención del consumo. Y bueno, la pregunta es, ¿cuál sería la necesidad de valor más importante? Si el valor de la experiencia estética o la experiencia de vida del consumidor, o el valor de la capacidad o potencialidad económica que tiene esta producción.
Okay. Estaba acá, 2.
No, es que aquí hay otra pregunta que yo luego Carlos y luego ya cerramos. Perdón por gritar.
Hola. Bueno, chance no es tanto una pregunta, es solamente como para hacer notar un punto entre lo que están hablando de propiedad privada, en sí el valor privado de la obra del arte, ¿no? Bueno, estaban hablando de conceptos de privacidad.
Breve, por favor, porque si no nos va a dar tiempo.
Ok. Bueno, voy a exponer nada más 3 conceptos.
No, por favor, si no va a ser una pregunta muy concreta, o sea, no, sí, porque estamos muy colgados de tiempo y no nos va a dar chance.
Pero bueno, ok, ¿cuál es su punto de vista en función de la secrecía y lo público que justamente no macha con lo privado en la obra del arte, ¿no? O sea, estábamos hablando también de que en esta taxonomización, marketing, violencia, autoría, propiedad, o sea, todos estos son conceptos que yo no puedo desvincular de lo privado, pero sí puedo desvincular de lo público y de lo secreto, como mecanismos para producir la obra de arte, ¿no? Entonces, de cierta forma, si hablamos de que la obra de arte se mueve bajo mecanismos que no son privados y se vuelve bajo mecanismos donde se vuelven comunes entre todo, o sea, en lo público o en lo secreto, yo siento que ahí es un poquito donde podemos tomar acción para generar valor en la obra de arte, porque también el valor de la obra de arte fuera de lo privado, que no se basa justo en estas categorías de taxonomización, se basaría más justo, como están haciendo ya notar, en el uso que se le da a la obra de arte y también con el valor emocional que adquiere la obra de arte en el intercambio.
Tu pregunta ya, ¿no? Fue la primera parte de tu exposición, ¿no? Ok, perfecto. ¿Y qué otra pregunta faltaba, Carlos? Y con esta es la última, ¿no? Si le pasan el micrófono, se los agradezco mucho. Gracias.
Ayer hablaba del mundo del arte y del mercado del arte. Mi pregunta es si son campos separados y por qué le tenemos tanto miedo al dinero.
Gracias. Entonces sí, ahora sí podemos empezar a responder. ¿Quién quiere empezar a abrir? Answer the different questions.
Okay, I'm going to cherry pick here. First of all, I'm going to have to, Dave and I are going to have a big argument about this, but I can't actually remember the quote. But Marx makes it quite clear, yes, nature is a source of wealth, but labor is the only source of value. And it's the only source of value in the sense that value constitutes how societies organize themselves. I mean, nature provides uses. We have to kind of organize ourselves socially when we labor in order to produce products. And also in the critique of the Gotta program, he also makes, I think, a very important point in this instance, where he says, you know, he's not interested in simply workers recovering the value that they produce, because what about people who can't produce, you know? Who's going to kind of benefit, if you like, from what they're not able to produce? So in some ways, the insistence on a kind of inalienable property of the producer, what about people who are not able to produce what they need and so on? You know? Marx is not interested in that. He's not interested in just in individuals retaining the property or value of what they earn. The question in relationship to Simon's question, I think, in relationship to artwork and personality, I think it's extremely difficult and in a way fundamental question. I mean, in some ways, the notion of inalienable property is fundamental to the constitution of a kind of, in a way, it produces the fundamental problem around which the whole notion about alienation takes place, and it's grounded in a sort of apparently Christian constitution of an inalienable personality. And then how do you account for the fact that that personality needs to apparently alienate themselves? They do in order to exist socially. Okay. And you know, in some ways, if you look, the distinction between, you know, how do you explain if labor, if you like, is inalienable? How do you explain wage labor? You know, I mean, you know, if you read kind of Hegel or something, he doesn't have a problem with craftsmen who sell their alienable products because these are stuff, you know, that's not connected to their body. But what about the fact that they have to kind of serve, you know, use their body? Well, how do you distinguish the sale of your labor from the sale of your body? You know? So these are fundamental questions, but I think there is a sense in which the relationship of inalienable property can be understood simply in a privative way, and it can be understood in a communist way, in the sense of everything that I produce is an extension of my body. Well, and then that means that the body is the social body, you know. It doesn't mean that it's my personal body, if you like, which is in some ways what defines human beings as tool users in this way, is the fact that they have prosthetic relationships to nature. They don't in some ways have a complete tool set within their body. They have to kind of extend that into the social realm. And the social realm becomes an extended body, which they then, if you like, need in order to exist socially. So in some ways you can understand this as a form of inalienable property, which leads to this, you know, communal, common constitution of inalienable property, rather than its retraction into an individual.
I just want to respond on this question about our problems with money. First of all, I don't have any problem with money. That's not the point. The point is that money, and especially money, is mixed up with value. That's one thing, and that it is used also as the main argument which makes everything death. The main argument of governments nowadays is to keep the budget in balance, to do everything. So it is used in a very pervert way to do policy, to do other things. And there the problem starts, I think, with money. And I want to go one in a definition struggle also about pervert. It was mentioned, I think, by Dave. Pervert in psychoanalysis means that you position yourself as an object of something, like the sadomasochist puts himself and enjoys it. That's perversion about it. What we see nowadays, and this is related to your question about money, that a lot of politicians and decision makers, but even also people, artists in the cultural field, find themselves again in a masochist way as an object of value. For example, defining yourself by human capital. This is a way of defining yourself as an object in a situation. And that's the pervert way of dealing with it. That's by saying, I'm not in charge of it. I'm not a subject who can do things. No, I do it because the object of another mechanism which makes decisions. And there's the whole problem starts, I think, with reasoning in amounts of money, etc. So money is not a problem. It's how you use it to make decisions.
Bueno, tenemos que dar por concluida esta sesión. Hay muchísimo que discutir, pero que si no nos va a dar tiempo de poder tener la discusión que sigue.
Entonces lo que vamos a hacer es vamos a cambiar de mesa.
De mesa, de idioma.
Y de generación, y de nacionalidad, y de todo, y de tono, y…
Eso, muchachos. Entonces,
no, y una cosa muy importante, al final de esto se va a presentar, hablamos de ellos en la introducción, se van a presentar los nodos. Este formato siempre, pedimos una disculpa, es muy difícil para la discusión. Entonces, la intención es que de alguna manera estas discusiones se puedan continuar ahí sí, haciendo todos los puntos que quiera hacer todo el mundo con toda la extensión que quiera, pero aquí no nos da tiempo, ya vamos 20 minutos tarde y no es justo comerle tiempo a los ponentes que siguen. Entonces, una disculpa por acortar participaciones y
aprovechen estos cambios rapidísimos para los que
si alguien tiene que